Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links deck profile. Today we were taking a look at Sea Serpents and the territory of the Sea Serpent King skill. Now, going into this box, there was a little bit of hype behind Sea Serpents because the possibilities were quite vast. Basically, the skill itself wasn't anything too impressive, but the expectation was that we would get Leviathan Dragon Daedalus to kind of help her out. The skill searches out the Umi, Daedalus would send the Umi, wipe the board, and be able to get in for some big damage. That was kind of the hope. The other thing is there are some really powerful Sea Serpent trap cards that, again, were part of the first wave during Sevens, but once again, we didn't get any of that, so we were a little bit disappointed. What we did get was a rather underwhelming skill with rather underwhelming bosses, especially when we also got the release of the Gaia structure deck, which was very, very powerful and kind of almost in a tier of its own, and it makes everything else from the box look even weaker, but I think this is definitely the biggest loser of the box. So first things first, let's take a look at the skill, Territory of the Sea Serpent King. Can be activated if all of the monsters in your constructed deck are water attribute monsters, and all of the monsters except level 2 to 4 monsters are Sea Serpents. Everything has to be water, but our 2 to 4s can be anything, so our 1s and then 5 and ups all have to be Sea Serpents. Make the original attack of one face-up level 7 or higher monster on your field become 2900 until the end of your turn. Okay, that's actually quite nice, especially because with Umi, that gets up to 31, which does let us attack over those big problematic 3Ks, which right now primarily is going to be the Dragon Fusion monsters. Now the issue is if our field spell gets outed, we now can't get over that number, and that can cause some problems. But if there is no card in your field zone, you can also set one Umi from your deck or graveyard, but only once per duel. Now, once per duel really sucks with this because we do have, for example, the Wyrm skill, which lets us get it every single turn. So this is not ideal, especially since if that Umi does get outed, we kind of don't have anything else to do. But let's talk about the boss monsters. So first up, we have our limited 3 Sea Dragon King Granganus. The requirement: during the turn that you normal summon this card, inflict damage to your opponent equals to the number of spell traps on your opponent's field times 300. So usually this is about 600, but obviously this could be 900, it could be less. 2500 attack is nice. Again, we summon this out, use the skill, boost it up to that 29, get the Umi, puts up to that 31, burn your opponent for a bit, smack in. That's not a terrible little loop, but it's also not super great. It's just kind of bash over something and get a little bit of damage in. There's not really much more to it. Next up, we're on 2 copies of Rhythmical Performer. This is in here because it's a water monster that's level 2 to 4, so we can use it, and occasionally this is a plus. Basically, any way that we can plus, we are going to take, because this deck really struggles with plussing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Rhythmical Performer is basically in here for a conditional, sometimes a draw. We only really want to summon this if we're really desperate, or if we are going to attribute it off immediately afterwards, but can be quite good. Then we have Head Bad Cachalot, and this is kind of the good boss of the deck, and it's not even that great. So 2500 attack is decent. Send the top card of your deck to the graveyard, which is a good cost. One face-up monster from your opponent's field loses 500 attack at the end of this turn, which means now we can attack over 3000. So this is actually reasonably powerful, especially since we can boost it again up to that 29, then we can get over or crash into up to 34s, which is pretty good. Then if you have Umi or Big Umi face-up on your field, inflict 500 damage. So this 500 damage doesn't come up too much, but when it does, it is quite nice. The deck does have like this kind of mini burn theme between its 2 boss monsters, but Cachalot is definitely the better of the bosses. Next up, we have Klindros, and I don't think we actually resolved Klindros' effect at all during testing, but this card is okay. 1000 attack and 300 defense kind of suck, but if your opponent has a monster on their field, we can place a Sea Dragon King Granganus, which notice we're only on 2 copies of, or a Grand Extreme, which is our limit 1 card, to the bottom of your deck to special summon a fish or sea serpent type monster from your hand face up to your field. So the only real way to get value out of this is to summon out a high level monster. Since we're not allowed to use fish, we can only summon out sea serpent, so it's either Headbutt Cachalot or Granganus. But even then, it's not that useful, because a lot of the time, we're not going to be in a situation where we're going to be able to summon out 2 from our hand. Like we said, we didn't actually resolve this effect once. Overall, I think this card is still pretty good, but it would be a lot better if we had more copies of Grand Extreme, because then we could actually make use of this a lot more often. Then we have Light Dolphin. I really like Light Dolphin. Light Dolphin's actually a really cool card. Its attack stat is a little bit low, only 500. 1000 defense is nice. If we have Umi or Big Umi face up on our field, and you have a fish, sea serpent, thunder, or aqua type normal monster face up on the field, we can draw a card. So this is our best way to draw. Now the downside is, we do need to find a normal monster, which isn't that bad. The issue is we need to have Umi on the field. So if we get our Umi using our skill, typically we'll get a draw off of Light Dolphin. and then let's say a couple turns pass and Umi gets popped. Well, now we no longer have access to Umi, so we can't ever use Light Dolphin again. It's just kind of dead for the rest of the game. So you could get around this by playing more copies of Umi, but then if you draw into them, they feel really, really bad. The whole point of the skill is it should fix the inconsistency by just letting us have access to the Umi, which is why if the skill let us get Umi every turn, the deck would feel a lot better. It still, I don't think, would be like a tiered deck, but it would feel a lot stronger if we just had access to the Umi at all times, especially since, again, our only way to plus is off of Light Dolphin. If we compare this to the other grind deck from the box, which being the Chemicalized Pyro deck, that deck gets to get a free +1 every single turn, and it can be a boss monster. So how are we supposed to beat a deck that can basically recycle their bosses every single turn and get a free plus every turn, when we can barely get a plus with Light Dolphin, and if we're lucky, we might get one with Rhythmical Performer? Realistically, they are just not in the same league, which is why in a grind game, this deck is not going to be very good into Pyro. Then we have the Hayasube and the Takriminos. These cards are just 1500 vanillas. They're both not bad. Obviously, Takriminos is better because it's high defense and it's a Sea Serpent, so it does turn on our Stream of Elimination. Then we have Grand Extreme. Grand Extreme was a card that was limited for a long time in OCG. The reason being that when we get the next wave of Sea Serpent supports and we get some of the really disgusting dark Sea Serpent monsters, they are actually very, very powerful, and Grand Extreme's Grave Hate effect also is very, very strong. As for right now, this probably didn't need to be limited. I'm not really sure why we have it limited, but we do. This card is still fine, right? We can cheat out our bosses, and when we do, it feels quite nice. Having a bit of Grave Hate can be relevant, especially since we're in kind of a Gaia meta, so putting back all the vanillas back into the deck can be quite nice, but it's nothing super crazy. Then we have Pot of Greed, because there isn't really a better card to use. We could use Tribute to the Doomed, but this deck doesn't plus very much, so we often do struggle to have a lot of cards, so discarding more cards doesn't really work out very well for us. Then we're on Clashing Twin Tides. This card is okay. Typically, if we get consistency spells like this, they are good. But this card puts a level 7, specifically, Fish or Sea Serpent back into our deck and draw 2. Now the issue is we could draw out the exact card we put back in, which is quite bad. With the other cards where we discard to draw 2, we basically lower the chance that we're going to draw into a brick because we've gotten one of the bricks into the graveyard, right? This basically keeps a brick in the deck, so it's worse just by definition. It's still an okay card. Sometimes it comes up and it can be really good, but I'm not the biggest fan of this card, and I don't think this card suddenly like fixes all of this deck's consistency issues. Then we have TSA. TSA is good. Obviously, recycling cards back into the deck can be good. Reducing your opponent's monster's attack can be good. And we need a way to be able to beat over really big things. I think one of the games we played today, we did actually play against a Cyber End Dragon. They just dropped it on the board. And if we didn't have Talismanic Seal Array, we couldn't realistically beat it. The only other way to do so would have been like cash a lot, with the skill and Umi on the field. So like it's just such a big ask, whereas Talismanic Seal Array just deals with the problem immediately. Then we have Stream of Elimination. This is just our back row hate. We have the one of Umi to be searched out with the skill, and we have the negate attack. So trap-wise, we could be playing Slime. And Slime is a good trap. But we had so many spell traps in this deck, I don't really think we could justify putting more in. This deck was originally designed by a Japanese player, and they did get a top 4 taunt result with it. But again, big asterisk. They had to beat one real deck, basically, to get there. They were on 3 copies of Crisis. Now, Crisis is quite a good card because it does have that kind of burn synergy. And if you're expecting to play a lot of pure Gaia or Gaia players that can leave 2 7s on the field, it could be quite good. But this was a day 1 tech that some people were using before kind of Metarion Gaia and Hero Gaia really came to the forefront of the meta. And Combustion Crisis is not anywhere near as good against those variants. So we basically took out the 3 copies of Combustion Crisis and we replaced them with 2 Talismanic Seal Array and the Rhythmical Performer. The only other difference was that they were on 3 copies of Granganus, but in testing we just kept bricking on it again and again and again, and unfortunately Clashing Twin Tides never really fixed it. The issue is we don't have a lot of ways to cheat these bosses out. We do have Kleindros, but Kleindros needs us to already have the graveyard set up. We do have Grand Extreme, but this is just a one-of. We need just ways to plus, like Light Dolphin, but realistically, Light Dolphin isn't online until we already have a boss out, because when we get a boss out, we can use the skill to add our Umi, and then we have the Umi ready to actually use the Light Dolphin to plus. So everything's kind of backwards in this deck, and it ends up feeling really underwhelming. Overall, this deck did okay when we were climbing the GRF ladder. But we did not play against very many people that were playing particularly competitive decks, and they weren't playing those decks to a particularly high level. We did beat a couple of Gaia players, which felt quite good, but very obviously we could see those Gaia players weren't making the most optimal plays. They weren't playing necessarily the most refined lists. We did have a couple of really good wins, But overall, this deck is a little bit cope. I would really like this deck to be stronger. I think this kit could have been stronger. It could have been released with a stronger skill. They could have released some of the trap cards. They could have given us better monsters in general. They could have given us 3 copies of Grand Extreme. And if they'd done all of that, maybe this deck would have been somewhat competitive. But realistically, this is a fun deck. You could still cog with this. You could 100% cog with this. You could possibly top 8 a tournament, but I think even that is going to be a bit of a stretch. You'd have to get very, very lucky. So overall, I don't think I could recommend this deck unless you're just a real big fan of the Sea Serpents. But again, when we get another wave of support, when we get the trap cards, if we get a better skill, when we get the Dark Sea Serpents, when we get Phaser and the Maximum stuff later, Sea Serpents will be very, very strong eventually, but not right now. But let's find some replays so I can show you what I've been talking about.